Have you ever been quietly erased from a place you helped build, like your fingerprints were wiped clean from the very walls you once held up? My name is Leonardo Marquez. I'm 56 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I was the invisible firewall behind one of the fastest-growing AI cybersecurity firms in North America, Neurolock Systems. They didn't escort me out. There was no scene, no shouting, just a 14-minute meeting in a cold glass office, and a phrase that still echoes, "You're brilliant, Leo, but you're no longer scalable." I didn't argue, I just nodded. And as I packed up the last 2 decades of my life into a brown cardboard box, I realized something strange, not sadness, not anger, just a quiet awareness they had just removed the one person who understood how every critical system actually worked. This isn't a story about revenge, not in the usual sense. It's about what happens when you delete experience, silence, wisdom, and trust automation over understanding. And 3 weeks later, when everything collapsed, they called me. If you've ever felt replaced, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside, this story is for you. Like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe, because the truth in this one may just change how you see value, respect, and power. It was a Tuesday morning when they scheduled what looked like a routine performance alignment meeting. I had been through dozens of those over the years, most of them meaningless. You walk in, get the usual nods, adjust a few metrics, get back to work. But this one felt different the moment I stepped into the room. The new VP, Sasha Velt, sat across the conference table, framed by a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline of downtown Seattle gleamed behind her, sterile and cold, just like her tone when she began to speak. "Leonardo, we've appreciated your contributions, truly. But as part of our agile transformation strategy, we're pivoting toward AI-native leadership. Talent that's digital first." I remember the way she said it. Clean, efficient, like she was uninstalling outdated software, not ending a 19-year human relationship. She didn't look at my hands, these same hands that wrote half the custom threat hunting protocols still running on their infrastructure. She didn't ask about the 72-hour crisis I solved in 2014 when an international breach nearly cost the company its first government contract. None of that mattered. "You're not being fired," she added, as if that softened anything. "We're simply reallocating core responsibilities to leaner, more adaptive teams. In other words, replaced." I scanned the room briefly, one HR rep sitting silently, eyes on a notepad. No eye contact, no real goodbye. Just that word again, transformation. I didn't fight. I didn't try to explain that the AI-generated code they were relying on couldn't handle layered encryption exploits without human-built logic trees. I didn't mention that the company's auto-response system to foreign cyber attacks was still built on a module I personally designed in 2011 during the Dark Hydra breach. What would be the point? Instead, I stood up, slowly nodded, and said, "Understood." Back at my workstation, I opened a hidden folder. Nothing malicious, just personal notes and diagrams, things I'd built on my own time over the years. I transferred what was mine. The rest I left untouched. I didn't take revenge. I took my dignity. I packed my few personal belongings into a box, my old coffee mug, a photo of my daughter from her graduation, a plaque from 2016, Excellence in Crisis Engineering. That one made me smile. The irony? As I walked out, I saw Juno, the youngest engineer on our team, watching me from behind her triple-monitor setup. Bright, capable, always curious. She had asked me last week to mentor her through the behavioral analysis API I'd built. I had said once things calmed down. Now they wouldn't. No speech, no farewell lunch, no email blast. Just a quiet exit from a company I had helped evolve from startup to national defense contractor. But as I stepped into the elevator, something inside me clicked into place. They hadn't just terminated a role. They had removed the only person who knew how their entire system truly worked. I joined Neurolock Systems in the spring of 2004. Back then, we weren't even called Neurolock. just a scrappy outfit in a shared co-working space above a print shop in Tacoma, trying to figure out how to stop early-generation spyware from hijacking small business networks. There were 12 of us, no benefits, no structure, just code coffee and chaos. I wasn't looking for glory. After spending years in military-grade systems integration, I wanted stability. My wife had just been diagnosed with early-stage lymphoma, and our daughter was in middle school. I needed work that mattered, but didn't destroy me. I started as a consultant fixing critical vulnerabilities and optimizing endpoint firewalls. I stayed because they listened, at least in the early years. Over the next 2 decades, I became the invisible backbone of the company's architecture. When we landed our first federal contract, it was me who designed the adaptive protocol that allowed real-time intrusion detection without compromising data throughput. When a rogue AI framework misclassified critical infrastructure in 2011, I spent 48 straight hours writing a patch in assembly language just to stabilize the system. Nobody clapped. There was no press release. But the client renewed for another 5 years. And that's how it went. I never made noise, never chased titles. I became the guy they called when something broke at 2:30 a.m. The one who didn't need documentation because I had built the system from the ground up. I wrote the recursive logic for threat anticipation that predicted anomalous patterns in deep packet inspection before the market even called it that. I built modular redundancies that kicked in when cloud services glitched long before zero-trust architecture became a buzzword. And yes, I trained people. Dozens, maybe more. I built internal toolkits, ran late-night sessions for junior engineers, reviewed sloppy code without ego. But the truth is, nobody ever really asked me to explain the full scope of what I'd done. They just assumed I'd always be there, that the system would run like lights coming on when you flip a switch. But the company began to change. The deeper we got into high-profile contracts, the more the culture shifted. Leadership started using phrases like cost efficiency and scalable alignment. The original founders sold their shares. In came the suits, strategy consultants, data-driven decision models. Then Sasha Velt appeared young, hyper-articulate, with a resume full of big-name incubators and TEDx appearances. She never once asked me how our internal AI firewall interacted with third-party threat monitors. Instead, she wanted to know why my code comments weren't formatted for AI parsing tools. The final year was a slow ghosting. I was excluded from future planning meetings, asked to document everything clearly for redundancy. Junior analysts were looped into processes I'd overseen solo for over a decade. It wasn't subtle, but it was calculated. Still, I did what I always did. I kept things running. When a critical kernel exploit surfaced in the middle of a product rollout last fall, I patched it myself within 11 hours while half the company was still in Slack channels debating who to blame. No memo went out, no one said thank you. But I saw the client's email, no disruption, impressive turnaround. That was enough. In the final month before my exit, I spent nights refining a defensive protocol called Deep Mesh, something I had been developing quietly for years. It was designed to respond not just to known threats, but to learn from shadow behaviors, those subtle, AI-generated anomalies that most systems miss. It worked. It was fast, lean, elegant. And it was buried. Because Sasha didn't understand it. Because it wasn't in a pitch deck. Because it didn't come with an impressive brand name or machine-learned buzzwords. They didn't just ignore what I built, they erased it. Not maliciously, just indifferently. Like replacing a handcrafted lock with a flashy new keypad, not realizing the old key still protected the vault underneath. So I stayed silent, finished the code, saved my final notes in a local drive, and when the time came, I walked out without fanfare. But the truth? They didn't just let go of a man. They released the only thread holding the company's most critical systems together. And they didn't even realize it yet. 3 weeks later, the silence broke. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a quiet Friday morning, sipping lukewarm coffee and going through onboarding materials from Etherfort, the company that had offered me a new position after hearing through the grapevine that I was suddenly available. That alone had made me smirk. In cybersecurity, word travels fast. Competence has a scent. And when someone like me is let go, unexpectedly, people in the industry pay attention. My phone buzzed. It was Juno. I hadn't heard from her since the day I left. I figured she might have been told not to, but this wasn't a friendly check-in. "Leo," she said, voice tight, hurried. "We have a situation. The system's failing." I set my coffee down. "Be specific." It started around 2:30 a.m. The real-time breach detection dashboard froze. Then the automated protocols stopped responding. When we tried to revert, the backups failed authentication. Now we're getting reports from 3 clients, 2 financial firms, and a medical database vendor. Their firewalls aren't syncing, and at least one thinks they've been compromised. I was quiet for a moment, listening to the weight in her voice. Not fear yet, but pressure. The kind that builds in good people when they're out of their depth and know it. "What happened to the deep mesh module?" I asked. She hesitated. "Sasha had some consultants come in last week. They said it was redundant and replaced it with a generative code solution. They called it AI optimized. But now it's throwing permission errors and misclassifying traffic spikes as false positives. And the rollback protocols encrypted. We tried accessing the admin recovery folder, but it's locked. No one has your access credentials." I sighed. Not out of satisfaction, out of inevitability. "What about the core API keys for the vendor syncs expired last night?" she whispered. "No one realized they needed to be manually refreshed through the legacy terminal. We assumed it was automated now." Of course they did. The whole team had been taught that the system ran itself, that legacy frameworks were clunky remnants of an outdated mindset. That human insight could be streamlined into predictive models and shiny dashboards. What they didn't understand, what Sasha never bothered to ask, was that the so-called legacy system wasn't old. It was handcrafted, built for nuance. It knew the difference between erratic data flow and a real breach, between harmless anomalies and slow drip attacks masked to look like noise. They had swapped a compass for a wind vane, and the storm had just arrived. Juno cleared her throat. "Sasha's asking if you could consult, just temporarily, to help stabilize." I looked out my window. A quiet street, neighbors walking their dogs, children biking past. My world was calm. Theirs wasn't. "I never sabotaged anything, Juno," I said softly. "But they removed me without a transition. They never requested access, transfers, never asked how the fallback systems were linked. They assumed automation was bulletproof." A long pause. Then she said, "So what do we do?" I didn't answer right away. I knew the protocols could be fixed, I could walk them through the process, but I also knew that if I did, the lesson would never stick. They'd patch over the problem and keep treating wisdom like it's replaceable. "Start by calling your vendors," I said finally. "Some of those contracts will need to be renegotiated now. You're not coming back, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm not." As I hung up, I felt no bitterness, only clarity. They thought I was a system component, but I was the human architecture beneath it all. And when you remove the wrong pillar, it's not sabotage that destroys the structure. It's the silence that follows. By Monday morning, the rumors had already started circulating. An internal Slack message leaked into my inbox from a former colleague. A screenshot of Sasha typing, "There's a possibility Leo left intentional gaps in the code to damage the system post-departure." Another line followed, blunt and desperate legal, "is reviewing sabotage protocols." Sabotage. The word sat in my chest like a stone. Not because I was afraid, because it revealed just how deeply they misunderstood everything I had ever done for that company. I had spent 19 years anticipating disasters before they struck, plugging silent vulnerabilities and building invisible safety nets under systems no one else understood. My logic trees were designed to adapt to threats, my backup protocols written for redundancy, not secrecy. But they were complex too, complex for plug-and-play AI solutions. Too layered for anyone who hadn't spent the time to truly understand the structure. I didn't create backdoors. I created contingency. But contingency only works when someone knows where the ladder is hidden. Sasha called me directly that afternoon. No assistant, no preamble. Just her clipped voice through the speaker of my phone. "Leo, I hope you know this isn't personal, but we have reason to believe your departure may have compromised our infrastructure." I paused, then said, "Define compromised. Our clients are experiencing syncing failures, automated threat protocols are down, and the AI-generated scripts we implemented have triggered false shutdowns in 2 law enforcement data clusters. And you believe I did this deliberately. I'm saying it's curious that key systems failed shortly after your exit, that certain credentials are inaccessible, that your documentation was frankly incomplete." "Do you remember what you asked me to do on my last day?" I said. She didn't answer. "You told me to write down my admin passwords on a sticky note. That was your exit protocol." I let that sit for a moment. The documentation existed, Sasha, but no one asked for it. No one scheduled a knowledge transfer. No one even asked what questions to start with. She was silent. I encrypted those systems not to exclude. I continued, but to protect. We were handling sensitive law enforcement, military, and medical infrastructure. You don't leave those exposed to junior analysts running test scripts. You create tiers of access and controlled gateways. "You should have informed someone." "I did," I said calmly. "I sent a transition readiness report to your assistant 2 weeks before my departure. It outlined every system status and what needed administrative review. It was never opened. A beat. Then, so you're saying this is our fault. I'm saying that you removed a key piece of your infrastructure and expected the architecture to remain intact. That's not sabotage, Sasha. That's negligence." She didn't respond, but I could feel the shift. The truth settling somewhere uncomfortable. For years, I had protected Neurolock from the chaos it never saw. My work had gone unnoticed because it worked flawlessly. And now that silence had turned into absence, and absence into crisis. What they called missing documentation was actually buried resilient systems, so stable they had never needed explanation until the moment they broke. They mistook simplicity for transparency, mistook automation for intelligence. But worst of all, they mistook me for replaceable, and the system now was reminding them otherwise. 2 days after that call with Sasha, I sat in the glass-walled conference room of Etherfort's Seattle office sunlight, poring over a sleek table scattered with whiteboards, system flow diagrams, and half-drunk mugs of black coffee. It felt nothing like Neurolock, no cold politeness, no corporate theater. Just focus energy and something I hadn't felt in years, respect. The offer had come within a week of my departure. Apparently, Etherfort had been following my work quietly for years, watching the evolution of Neurolock's defensive architecture from the outside. They admired its consistency, the way it adapted with minimal noise, minimal failure. What they didn't know, of course, was that most of that adaptive logic had been handcrafted by me. But what struck me more was that they didn't just want my code. They wanted my mind. Patricia Singh, the company's head of infrastructure engineering, didn't talk to me like a checklist. She asked real questions. She listened. Not once did she use the term legacy talent. Instead, she said, "We're not here to replace people with AI. We're here to build AI that learns from the best of us." The role they offered Director of Human AI Resilience Engineering. A long title, sure, but with one clear message: my experience wasn't a liability here. It was an asset. The compensation package was 20% higher than what I earned at Neurolock. More importantly, it included creative freedom. They didn't want another executor. They wanted a strategist, someone to architect not just systems, but culture. And so I said yes. On my 3rd day, Patricia and I reviewed candidate profiles for junior roles. That's when her eyes stopped on one resume. "Do you know a Juno Reyes?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes, she's sharp, learns fast, detail-oriented, and the only person back at Neurolock who asked the right questions. She applied last night, Patricia said. Her cover letter mentioned you. She said you always took the time to explain not just what the code did, but why it worked. That hit me harder than I expected. In a place where my name was now associated with sabotage accusations, here was someone still carrying the truth. I told Patricia, if she's available, hire her. Juno joined 2 weeks later. Her first day was quiet, but I could tell she was soaking in everything. She'd been bruised by the chaos, but not broken, and I knew that kind of resilience would serve her well. Together, we began designing a new generation of intrusion prevention protocols, ones that combined predictive AI models with layered human-led judgment systems. We didn't just want fast, we wanted trustworthy. We didn't want systems that looked good in demos. We wanted systems that held up when the world broke at 2 a.m. I started mentoring again, this time with intention. This wasn't about protecting my job. It was about building something sustainable, something smarter than ego or title. The irony, I was doing almost the exact same work I'd done at Neurolock Systems: integration, behavioral risk, modeling, structural resilience planning. But here, every insight was valued. Every time I pulled out an old diagnostic method, someone took notes, not because it was trendy, but because it worked. And slowly, something inside me began to shift. The bitterness faded. The weight lifted. I wasn't looking back anymore. Because while Neurolock had decided I was obsolete, Etherfort saw me as foundational. And in this new place, I wasn't just rebuilding systems, I was rebuilding legacy on my own terms. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It was slow, almost theatrical in its precision, like watching dominoes fall in perfect rhythm. First, Neurolock's flagship client, a defense-adjacent firm specializing in satellite security, issued a formal complaint citing systemic instability and unresolved vulnerabilities. That alone sent minor ripples through the industry. But then came the second wave. Within 10 days, 2 more major clients suspended contracts due to synchronization failures between their encrypted databases and Neurolock's automated monitoring systems. The very modules I had built carefully modularly and with layered contingencies had either been removed or optimized beyond function. What they replaced them with couldn't handle real-world volatility. The scripts failed under pressure. AI models flagged harmless activity while letting real exploits pass, unnoticed. From what I heard through the industry circuit, panic had overtaken strategy. Contractors were being flown in from New York and Chicago. Emergency code freezes were issued. Whole clusters were taken offline just to run manual diagnostics on what used to be automatic. Internally, people were working 14-hour days just trying to stop the bleeding. That's when the second call from Sasha came. She didn't open with pretense this time. Leo, I'm reaching out again. I know you've declined before, but the situation has escalated. We're in need of someone who understands the foundational structure of the system, not just technically, but philosophically. Philosophically. Now that was new. I let her finish. She explained that 3 of their top 5 clients had now issued written warnings. Their consultants had failed to reverse engineer the scripts I'd built. Attempts to restore older code were creating recursive errors. They were falling apart faster than their AI systems could predict. I'm offering a formal consulting engagement, she said. We're prepared to compensate you accordingly and grant you full autonomy in the recovery process. I paused, then said, That's kind of you, but I've already accepted a permanent position with Etherfort. There was silence, then the shift I had expected. Etherfort, Leo. They're one of our direct competitors. They're also a company that treats knowledge as an asset, not an overhead expense, I replied. They don't replace wisdom with dashboards. Her voice tightened. I hope you understand that any proprietary logic you developed under Neurolock is protected by our contractual clauses. Any overlap could result in serious legal review. I exhaled through my nose. There it was, the pivot from invitation to threat. Are you implying that I'm sharing Neurolock's proprietary intelligence? I'm stating that we're monitoring all avenues of exposure. Given the current state of affairs, we have to protect our interests. I sat back in my chair, calm. Sasha let me make something very clear. I never took a single line of code. I built what I needed for Etherfort from scratch. What's failing over there isn't because of sabotage. It's because you deleted the map and fired the cartographer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just ended the call with the same tone she used to let me go clinical and final. What Sasha never understood, and what Neurolock was now learning too late, is that competence can't be automated. Loyalty can't be outsourced. And when you cut away the roots, the tree doesn't fall right away. But it falls. By the end of that quarter, the consequences had crystallized. The Department of Defense officially suspended all ongoing evaluations, with Neurolock citing critical operational inconsistencies and failure to meet continuity compliance protocols. That statement alone was damning. But what followed sealed their fate. A confidential leak, later confirmed by two separate sources, revealed that Sasha had suppressed multiple internal reports warning about the fragility of the new system post-integration. Engineers had flagged errors in the AI-optimized protocols weeks before the major failures, but were told to trust the process and let the model adapt. What those engineers didn't know was that Sasha had already committed to deliverables in public statements, backed by numbers that only made sense if the old infrastructure was removed. When the board found out, it didn't matter how impressive her resume looked anymore. She was removed within 48 hours. Neurolock tried to rebrand to recover its footing, but the damage was cultural now. Clients didn't just see system failure, they saw a company willing to gamble with trust for the sake of trend. Meanwhile, at Etherfort, we weren't just winning clients. We were rebuilding confidence. Patricia called me into a meeting room in early spring with a list of incoming project requests. 3 more former Neurolock clients want proposals, she said. They've heard about the way you handled the migration for Sentinel Core. They're asking if you'd lead theirs personally. I didn't smile out of pride. I smiled out of alignment. Because here, every hour I worked was respected. Every strategy I shared was studied, not second-guessed. Juno had become more than an apprentice. She was now leading a team of her own, applying the principles I had taught her with a level of creativity that inspired the entire department. She didn't try to imitate my work, she evolved it. And watching her navigate challenges reminded me that the best legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you lift. One afternoon, while reviewing a system architecture diagram she'd submitted, I noticed she had used a branching logic tree built from one of my old threat recognition models, but adapted with a new AI scoring layer I'd never considered. It worked better than mine. That's when it hit me. What I had always protected wasn't just a set of systems, it was a way of thinking, a method, a mindset that refused shortcuts and prized resilience over speed. And now that mindset had found fertile ground to grow. Justice didn't come in the form of lawsuits or press takedowns. It came in quiet conversations behind closed doors in boardrooms where executives whispered, "How did we miss this?" It came in the job offers that no longer went to Neurolock, in the silence of their once crowded lobby. In the way new clients introduced themselves with, "We heard you were the one who built the original system that never failed." I didn't need to win publicly. The real victory was continuity. The seamless thread of principle passed from one builder to the next, not because of titles, not because of revenge, but because the work mattered. And now I was doing it somewhere that understood that from day one. 6 months later, I was driving through the industrial park on the north edge of Seattle when I found myself turning down a familiar street. It wasn't planned, just one of those instinctive moments when memory pulls the wheel. The old Neurolock headquarters stood quiet, half the blinds drawn, half the signage removed. The parking lot, once overflowing with Teslas and task force energy, was nearly empty. A for lease sign leaned against the front glass, weather-worn and heavy with silence. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. But for a moment, I looked through the tinted passenger window, half expecting to see some reflection of my old self, still pacing those halls, fixing the unfixable, holding up a system with sheer will. There was nothing there. And that was the justice. The systems I built didn't collapse because I left. They collapsed because no one cared to understand them, because they believed that code could replace character, that AI could substitute for accountability. As I merged back into traffic, I thought, in an age obsessed with algorithms, they forgot one truth. When you erase the human mind behind the machine doesn't break immediately. It simply forgets how to survive. Experience isn't obsolete, it's irreplaceable. What happened at Neuralock isn't just a story about corporate misjudgment. It's a mirror held up to every industry racing toward automation without respect for the people who built the foundations. Systems, technical or human, don't fail overnight. They unravel when wisdom is dismissed, when knowledge isn't transferred, and when silence replaces mentorship. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply stepped away, and the truth revealed itself. Not out of revenge, but because systems built without continuity eventually expose their own fragility. If you've ever been told you're no longer needed, remember this: your value isn't measured by how trendy your methods are, but by how deep your principles run when pressure hits. In a world chasing speed, be the one who builds things that last. Comment below: I'd rather be underestimated and essential than visible and replaceable. And if this story spoke to something you've lived or something you've feared, consider sharing it. Not for me, but for someone else who may be doubting their worth in a world that seems to move too fast to notice them. Because sometimes the most powerful reminder of value is what remains standing after everything else falls.